7. Leaving Zurich for Prague a few years earlier, Tomas had quietly said to himself, "Es muss sein," he was thinking of his love for Teresa. No sooner had he crossed the border, however, than he began to doubt whether it actually did have to be. Later, lying next to Teresa, he recalled that he had been led to her by a chain of laughable coincidences that took place 7 years earlier when the chief surgeon's sciatica was in its early stages, and were about to return him to a cage from which he would be unable to escape. Does that mean his life lacked any es muss sein, any overriding necessity? In my opinion, it did have one, but it was not love, it was his profession. He had come to medicine not by coincidence or calculation, but by a deep inner desire. Insofar as it is possible to divide people into categories, the surest criterion is the deep-seated desires that orient them to one or another lifelong activity. Every Frenchman is different, but all actors in the world are similar. In Paris, Prague, or the back of beyond, an actor is someone who in their early childhood consents to exhibit himself for the rest of his life to an anonymous public. Without that basic consent, which has nothing to do with talent, which goes deeper than talent, no one can become an actor. Similarly, a doctor is someone who consents to spend his life involved with human bodies and all that they entail. That basic consent, and not talent or skill, enables him to enter the dissecting room during the first year of medical school and persevere for the requisite number of years. Surgery takes the basic imperative of the medical profession to its outermost border, where the human makes contact with the divine. When a person is clubbed violently on the head, he collapses and stops breathing. Someday he will stop breathing anyway. Murder simply hastens a bit what God will eventually see to on his own. God, it may be assumed, took murder into account. He did not take surgery into account. He never suspected that someone would dare to stick his hand into the mechanism he had invented, wrapped carefully in skin, sealed away from human eyes. When Tomas first positioned his scalpel in the skin of a man asleep under an anesthetic, then breached the skin with a decisive incision and finally cut it open with a precise and even stroke as if it were a piece of fabric, a coat, a skirt, a curtain, he experienced a brief but intense feeling of blasphemy. Then again, that was what attracted him to it. That was the es muss sein rooted deep inside him, and it was planted there not by chance, not by the chief's sciatica, or by anything external. But how could he take something so much a part of him and cast it off so fast, so forcibly, so lightly? He would respond that he did it so as not to let the police misuse him. But to be quite frank, even if it was theoretically possible, and even if a number of cases have actually occurred, it was not too likely that the police would make public false statement over his signature. Granted, a man has a right to bear dangers that are less than likely to occur. Granted, he was annoyed with himself at his clumsiness and desired to avoid further contact with the police and the concomitant feeling of helplessness. And granted, he had lost his profession anyway, because the mechanical aspirin medicine he practiced at the clinic had nothing in common with his concept of medicine. Even so, the way he rushed into his decision seems rather odd to me. Could it perhaps conceal something else? Something deeper that escaped his reasoning? 8. Even though he came to love Beethoven through Teresa, Tomas was not particularly knowledgeable about music, and I doubt that he knew the true story behind Beethoven's famous es muss sein motif. This is how it goes. A certain Dimscher owed Beethoven 50 florins. When the composer, who was chronically short of funds, reminded him of the debt, Dimscher heaved a mournful sigh and said, "Muss es sein?" To which Beethoven replied with a hearty laugh, "Es muss sein," and immediately jotted down these words in their melody. On this realistic motif he then composed a canon of 4 voices, 3 voices, sing es muss sein, ja, 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 it must be, yes, 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 and the 4th voice chimes in with heraus mit dem Beutel, out with the purse. A year later, the same motif showed up as the basis for the 4th movement of the last quartet, opus 135. By that time, Beethoven had forgotten about Dimscher's purse. The words es muss sein had acquired a much more solemn ring. They seemed to issue directly from the lips of fate. In Kant's language, even good morning, suitably pronounced, can take the shape of metaphysical thesis, driven as the language of heavy words. Es muss sein was no longer a joke. It had become der schwer gefasste Entschluss, the difficult or weighty resolution. So Beethoven turned a frivolous inspiration into a serious quartet, a joke into metaphysical truth. It is an interesting tale of light going to heavy, or as Parmenides would have it, positive going to negative, yet oddly enough the transformation fails to surprise us. We would have been shocked, on the other hand, if Beethoven had transformed the seriousness of his quartet into the trifling joke of a four-voice canon about Dymsher's purse. Had he done so, however, he would have been in the spirit of Parmenides and made heavy go to light, that is, negative to positive. First, as an unfinished sketch, would have come the great metaphysical truth, at last a finished masterpiece, the most frivolous of jokes, but we no longer know how to think of Parmenides' thought. It is my feeling that Tomas had long been secretly irritated by the stern, aggressive, solemn Esmosane, that he harbored deep desire to follow the spirit of Parmenides and make heavy go to light. Remember that at one point in his life he broke completely with his first wife and his son, and that he was relieved when both his parents broke with him. What could be at the bottom of it all but a rash and not quite rational move to reject what proclaimed itself to be his weighty duty, his Esmosane? That, of course, was an external Esmosane reserved for him by social convention, whereas Esmosane of his love for medicine was internal. So much the worse for him. Internal imperatives are all the more powerful, and therefore all the more of an inducement to revolt. Being a surgeon means slitting open the surface of things and looking at what lies hidden inside. Perhaps Tomas was led to surgery by a desire to know what lies hidden on the other side of Esmosane. In other words, what remains of life when a person rejects what he previously considered his mission. The day he reported to the good-natured woman responsible for the cleanliness of all shop windows and display cases in Prague, he was confronted with the result of his decision in all its concrete and inescapable reality. He went into a state of shock, a state that kept him in its thrall during the first few days of his new job. But once he got over the astounding strangeness of his new life, it took him about a week, he suddenly realized he was simply on a long holiday. Here he was doing things he didn't care a darn about, and enjoying it. Now he understood what made people he always pitied, happy when they took a job without feeling the compulsion of an internal Esmosane, and forgot it the moment they left for home every evening. This was the first time he had felt that blissful indifference. Whenever anything went wrong on the operating table, he would be despondent and unable to sleep. He would even lose his taste for women. The Esmosane of his profession had been like a vampire sucking his blood. Now he roamed the streets of Prague with brush and pole, feeling 10 years younger. The salesgirls all called him Doctor. The Prague Bush Telegraph was working better than ever, and asked his advice about their colds, aching backs, and irregular periods. They seemed almost embarrassed to watch him douse the glass with water, fit the brush on the end of the pole, and start washing. If they could have left their customers alone in the shops, they would surely have grabbed the pole from his hands and washed the windows for him. Most of Tomas's orders came from large shops, but his boss sent him out into private customers too. People were still reacting to his mass persecution of Czech intellectuals. With the euphoria of solidarity and with his former patients brought out that Tomas was washing windows for a living, they would phone in and order him by name. Then they would greet him with a bottle of champagne or slivovitz, sign for 13 windows on their order slip, and chat with him for 2 hours, drinking to his health, and all the while Tomas would move on to his next flat or shop in a capital mood. While the families of Russian officers settled in throughout the land and radios intoned ominous reports of police fictionaries who had replaced cashiered broadcasters, Tomas reeled into the streets of Prague from one glass of wine to the next like someone going from party to party. It was his grand holiday. He had reverted to his bachelor existence. Teresa was suddenly out of his life. The only times he saw her were when she came back from the bar late at night, and he woke befuddled from half-sleep in the morning, when she was a befuddled one, and he was hurrying off to work. Each workday he had 16 hours to himself, an unexpected field of freedom, and from Tomas's early youth that had meant women. 9. When his friends asked him how many women he had in his life, he would try to evade the question, and when they pressed him further, he would say, well, 200 give or take a few. The envious among them accused him of stretching the truth. That's not so many, he would say by self-defense. I've been involved with women for about 25 years now. Divide 200 by 25, and you'll see it comes only to 8 or so women a year. That's not so many, is it? But setting up house with Teresa cramped his style. Because of organizational difficulties it entailed, he had been forced to relegate his erotic activities to a narrow strip of time between the operating room and home, which he thought he had used intensively as a mountain farmer tills his narrow plot for all it's worth, which is nothing like the 16 hours now had suddenly been bestowed on him. I say 16 hours because the 8 hours he spent washing windows were filled with new salesgirls, housewives, and female functionaries, each of whom represented a potential erotic engagement. What did he look for in them? What attracted him to them? Isn't making love merely an eternal repetition of the same? Not at all. There is always a small part that is unimaginable. When he saw a woman in her clothes, he could naturally imagine more or less that she would look like naked, and his experience as a doctor supplementing his experience as a lover. But between the approximation of the idea and the precision of reality, there was a small gap of the unimaginable, and it was that hiatus that gave him no rest. And then the pursuit of the unimaginable does not stop at the revelations of nudity. It goes much further. How would she behave while undressing? What would she say when he made love to her? How would her sighs sound? How would her face distort at the moment of orgasm? What is unique about the eye hides itself exactly in what is unimaginable about a person. All we are able to imagine is what makes everyone like everyone else. What people have in common. The individual eye is what differs from the common stock. That is what cannot be guessed at or calculated. What must be unveiled, uncovered, and conquered. Tomas, who spent the last 10 years of his medical practice working exclusively with the human brain, knew that there is nothing more difficult to capture than the human eye. There are many more resemblances between Hitler and Einstein or Brezhnev and Solzhenitsyn than there are differences. Using numbers, we might say there is 1 millionth part dissimilarity to the 999,999 millionth part similarity. Tomas was obsessed by the desire to discover and appropriate that 1 millionth part. He saw it as the core of his obsession. He was not obsessed with women, he was obsessed with what in each of them is unimaginable, obsessed, in other words, with the 1 millionth part that makes a woman dissimilar to others of her sex. Here, too, perhaps, his passion for surgery and his passion for women came together. Even as his mistress, he could never quite put down the imaginary scalpel, since he longed to take possession of something deep inside them. He needed to slit them open. We may ask, of course, why he sought that 1 millionth part dissimilarity in sex and nowhere else.